I never thought my HOA Karen would cut off water to my daughter's ranch barn. But there I stood at 7 in the morning, staring at a brand new padlock on the water valve that had fed Emma's livestock for 3 years. The metal was still shiny, mocking me in the early sunlight as my daughter's prize-winning horses whinnied desperately from their stalls, tongues already hanging from the oppressive heat that promised to hit 100 degrees by noon. "Dad, what are we going to do?" Emma's voice cracked behind me, and I turned to see my 24-year-old daughter clutching a bucket she'd been using to carry water from the house, a futile gesture when you're trying to hydrate 12 horses, 6 cattle, and a barn full of smaller animals. Her face was streaked with dirt and panic, the same expression she'd worn as a little girl when thunderstorms scared her awake. But this wasn't a storm we could wait out. This was deliberate sabotage. The note taped to the valve made my blood boil. Water usage violation. Contact HOA immediately. Margaret Whitfield, HOA President. That signature belonged to the woman who'd made my life hell for the past 6 months. Ever since Emma moved her equestrian business to the property I'd bought specifically for her dreams. Margaret, or Karen, as I'd started calling her in my head, had appointed herself the neighborhood's water police, despite having zero authority over anything beyond her own manicured lawn. I ripped the note down, crumpling it in my fist. "We're going to fix this," I told Emma, though my mind was already racing through the implications. Without water, her animals would start suffering within hours. The veterinary bills alone could bankrupt her fledgling business, not to mention the potential animal cruelty charges if anything happened to those beautiful creatures she'd spent years training. "She can't do this, can she?" Emma asked, desperation bleeding through her usual confidence. My daughter had faced down 1,000-pound stallions without flinching, but the bureaucratic cruelty of a power-hungry neighbor was something entirely different. "The water line runs directly to our property. We've been paying for it." That's when the real fury hit me. Emma didn't know what I knew. She had no idea about the paperwork I'd carefully filed away 30 years ago, the contracts and deeds and water rights that made Margaret's little power play not just illegal, but laughably stupid. My daughter saw her father as a simple retiree who'd worked construction his whole life, someone who bought her this ranch property as a generous but straightforward gift. She had no clue that her old man controlled every drop of water that flowed through this entire subdivision. Margaret Whitfield was about to learn that some people's quiet nature isn't weakness, it's strategy. And after 3 decades of letting others underestimate me, I was ready to show this HOA Karen exactly who she'd decided to mess with. The reservoir that fed every sprinkler system, every swimming pool, and every morning coffee maker in our neighborhood had my name on the deed. But first, I had to watch my daughter's animals suffer through what would be the longest day of both our lives. To understand why Margaret's attack cut so deep, you need to know how I built this empire from nothing. 32 years ago, I was a 25-year-old construction worker with calloused hands and a pregnant wife, staring at a barren piece of land that everyone said was worthless. The real estate agent practically laughed when I asked about the water rights. "Son, there ain't no water out there. That's why it's so cheap." But I'd done my homework. I'd spent months at the county records office, tracing geological surveys and old mining claims, learning that a massive underground aquifer ran directly beneath this property. The previous owner had died without heirs, and nobody understood what they were selling. I bought not just the land, but every water right associated with it, including the future reservoir that would eventually supply the entire Meadowbrook subdivision. Emma was born that same year, and every decision I made was for her future. While my neighbors saw a man laying foundation after foundation, I was building something bigger. I negotiated with the city to become the primary water supplier for any development in the area. Every permit, every contract, Every legal document bore my signature. When developers came knocking 15 years later, wanting to build luxury homes around the reservoir I'd constructed, they had to pay me licensing fees for every drop their residents would ever use. That's how a construction worker became a millionaire without anyone noticing. Emma grew up thinking her dad was just really good at fixing things. She never questioned why we could afford her riding lessons, why her college tuition never seemed to stress me out, or why I could buy her this perfect ranch property as a graduation gift. I let her believe it was careful savings and good investments. The truth was more complex. I owned the infrastructure that made modern life possible in our little corner of the world. Her equestrian business wasn't just a hobby to me. It was the culmination of everything I'd worked for. Emma had Olympic-level talent, the kind of natural ability that transforms horses from animals into poetry in motion. She'd spent her childhood weekends at competitions, her teenage years training with the best instructors money could buy, and her college years studying equine science while keeping her grades perfect. The ranch barn wasn't just a building, it was her dream made manifest. Every stall had been custom designed for her specific horses. The training arena met international competition standards. The water system I'd installed could handle everything from basic hydration to the specialized hydrotherapy equipment she used for rehabilitation work. Wealthy clients drove hours to bring their horses to Emma's facility because she delivered results that seemed impossible. Margaret knew all of this when she decided to attack. She'd watched Emma's success with the bitter resentment of someone whose own children had disappointed her. Margaret's son had dropped out of law school to become a gaming streamer. Her daughter lived in their basement at 35, claiming to be an influencer while Margaret paid her credit card bills. But Emma was everything Margaret's kids weren't. Successful, independent, respected in her field, financially stable through her own merit. And now Margaret had found a way to hurt her. The cruelty wasn't random. Margaret had planned this attack carefully, waiting for the hottest day of the year, knowing that Emma had a major client bringing 5 horses for a week-long training intensive. The timing would force Emma to either cancel losing thousands in revenue and damaging her reputation, or risk genuine harm to the animals in her care. Margaret thought she was playing chess with a simple construction worker who'd gotten lucky. She had no idea she'd just declared war on the person who controlled every faucet, every sprinkler, every swimming pool in her perfect little neighborhood. I'd spent 3 decades letting people underestimate me, building power so quietly that even my own daughter didn't understand what I'd accomplished. But Emma's tears changed everything. Watching my brilliant, capable daughter reduced to carrying water buckets like some medieval peasant, that was the moment I decided Margaret had finally picked the wrong fight. I found Margaret 2 hours later in her pristine front yard, directing a landscaping crew while sipping iced tea from a crystal glass. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was literally watering her petunias while my daughter's animals suffered in the heat. She saw me coming and actually smiled, that smug expression of someone who thinks they've won before the game even starts. "Oh, hello there," she called out in that sickeningly sweet voice she used when she wanted to seem reasonable. "I assume you got my note about the water situation." "Cut the act, Margaret." I stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at me. "You illegally tampered with private property and endangered livestock. Remove that padlock immediately." Her laugh was like nails on a chalkboard. "Illegally? Oh, honey, you clearly don't understand how homeowner associations work." She gestured toward her perfectly manicured lawn, sprinklers still running despite the water restrictions she'd supposedly imposed on everyone else. "As HOA president, I have full authority to enforce water usage violations. Your daughter's little horse hobby is consuming excessive resources during a drought." "What drought?" I looked pointedly at the water streaming across her sidewalk. Seems like there's plenty of water for your landscaping projects. That's completely different, she snapped, her mask slipping just enough to show the Karen underneath. Residential properties have different allowances than commercial operations. And make no mistake, what your daughter is running is a business, which violates our residential zoning codes. This woman had done her homework, I'll give her that. She'd researched every possible angle to justify her attack, probably spent weeks planning this moment. But she'd made one critical error. She assumed I was just another pushover neighbor who'd cave under bureaucratic pressure. "Show me the documentation," I said calmly. "Show me exactly where in the HOA covenants it gives you authority over private water lines running to private property." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by men she considered beneath her social status. "I don't need to show you anything. The authority is inherent in my position as what? A volunteer position in a neighborhood club?" I stepped closer, and something in my expression made her landscaping crew stop working to watch. "Margaret, you seem to be confused about something fundamental here. You have zero legal authority over my property or my family." "We'll see about that." She pulled out her phone with theatrical flair. "I've already contacted our HOA attorney about this situation. He assures me that commercial water usage violations can result in immediate disconnection and significant fines." That's when I realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. Margaret hadn't just acted impulsively. She'd built an entire legal framework in her mind to justify what she'd done. In her twisted worldview, she was the righteous enforcer protecting the neighborhood from my daughter's excessive water usage. "Your attorney told you that you could physically cut off someone's private water supply?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far her delusions extended. "When it affects the entire community's resources, yes?" Margaret's voice rose with righteous indignation. "Do you have any idea how much water those animals consume? Emma's selfish hobby is driving up costs for everyone." Selfish hobby. I repeated the word slowly, tasting the insult. My daughter's Olympic-level equestrian training is a selfish hobby. Don't be dramatic. She's not going to the Olympics. That comment hit harder than Margaret probably intended. Emma had come heartbreakingly close to making the last Olympic team, missing the cut by a fraction of a point in the final qualifier. She'd channeled that disappointment into building her training business, working 18-hour days to create something meaningful from her dreams. Margaret knew exactly how much that comment would hurt. She'd weaponized my daughter's greatest disappointment. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're going to remove that padlock within the next hour, or I'm calling the sheriff to report vandalism and theft of services." "You can call whoever you want," Margaret laughed. "I have documentation, legal backing, and community support. You have an entitled daughter who thinks rules don't apply to her." The landscaping crew had completely stopped working now, sensing that this conversation was escalating beyond normal neighborhood disputes. Margaret seemed to feed off their attention, playing to her audience of hired witnesses. "Last chance, Margaret. Remove the padlock. Or what? You'll sue me?" She practically giggled. "Good luck explaining to a judge why your daughter deserves special treatment for her Little Pony Club." That's when I realized that Margaret genuinely believed she held all the cards. She'd convinced herself that her HOA position granted her real power, that her attorney's advice made her legally untouchable, and that I was just another neighbor who'd eventually submit to her authority. She had no idea she'd just declared war on the person who could turn off her morning shower with a single phone call. Margaret's next move came faster than I expected. By noon, I had 3 different legal documents shoved under my door, all printed on official letterhead, all threatening immediate action if Emma didn't cease her commercial water violations. The HOA attorney had apparently worked overtime to create an impressive paper trail that would intimidate most people into submission. But the real escalation started when Margaret began rallying the neighbors. "Did you know?" she announced at an emergency HOA meeting she'd called for that same evening, "that Emma's little horse business is consuming over 2,000 gallons per day. That's more water than 5 normal households combined." She stood at the head of our community center, pointing to charts and graphs she'd somehow produced in less than 12 hours. I sat in the back, watching her performance with growing amazement. Margaret had transformed from a petty neighbor into a full-scale propaganda machine. The charts looked professional, the statistics sounded alarming, and she delivered it all with the righteous fury of someone exposing a massive scandal. "While we're all making sacrifices, conserving water, letting our lawns go brown," Margaret continued, her voice rising dramatically, "the property is running what amounts to a commercial stable operation. And when I tried to address this reasonably, I was threatened with lawsuits." Murmurs rippled through the room. I recognized most of the faces decent people who genuinely cared about the neighborhood, now being fed carefully crafted half-truths by a master manipulator. Margaret had positioned herself as the brave whistleblower, fighting against entitled special treatment. "Furthermore," she said, producing another document with theatrical flair, "our legal counsel has confirmed that commercial operations violating residential zoning can result in the entire neighborhood losing our preferential water rates. Emma's business could cost every family here hundreds of dollars per month in increased utility bills." That was a complete lie, but it landed perfectly. I watched neighbors, who'd always been friendly, suddenly look at me with suspicion and concern. Margaret had weaponized their legitimate worry about rising costs, turning it into ammunition against my daughter. The meeting got uglier from there. Margaret opened the floor for community input, which became a carefully orchestrated pile-on. Mrs. Henderson complained about the constant traffic from Emma's clients, though Emma maybe had 3 visitors per week. Mr. Rodriguez mentioned the smell from the barn, despite living half a mile away. Even the Johnsons, who'd always loved watching Emma train her horses, suddenly had concerns about property values and neighborhood character. Margaret had spent the day making phone calls, planting seeds of resentment and fear. She'd convinced nearly 24 neighbors that Emma's success was somehow threatening their way of life. The psychology was brilliant and disgusting in equal measure. "I motion," Margaret announced with perfect timing, "that we formally notify Emma that her commercial activities must cease within 30 days, or the HOA will pursue all available legal remedies." The motion passed 23-4. I was one of the 4. But Margaret wasn't finished. Over the next week, the harassment escalated to levels that would have impressed a military psychological warfare unit. She filed noise complaints with the county, claiming Emma's horses were disturbing the peace at all hours. She reported suspicious commercial activity to the zoning board, triggering an official investigation that required Emma to provide detailed financial records and operational schedules. Most insidiously, Margaret began what she called documentation patrols. Every morning, she'd walk past our property with her phone, recording video of Emma's daily routine. She filmed clients arriving, horses being exercised, even Emma cleaning stalls. The videos appeared on the neighborhood Facebook group, with captions like "commercial activity in clear violation of residential zoning," and "while we conserve water, this continues." Emma started crying herself to sleep. The constant scrutiny and manufactured controversy were destroying her confidence and her business. Clients began canceling, worried about being caught up in neighborhood drama. Emma's reputation, built over years of dedicated work, was being systematically demolished by a woman who'd never spent 5 minutes learning what actually happened at the ranch. The breaking point came when Margaret escalated to direct intimidation. She started parking across the street from our property every morning, sitting in her car with binoculars, obviously filming everything. When Emma came outside to feed the horses, Margaret would loudly talk into her phone about documenting violations and building the case. My daughter, who would never back down from a 1,000-pound stallion, started sneaking around her own property like a criminal. That's when I realized that Margaret's campaign wasn't really about water usage or zoning violations. This was about power and jealousy, pure and simple. She'd found a way to tear down someone whose success made her feel inadequate, and she was enjoying every minute of it. But Margaret had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that because I'd stayed quiet during her public attacks, I was weak. She confused strategic patience with helplessness. Margaret was about to learn the difference between those two things in the most humiliating way possible. The morning after Margaret's latest surveillance stunt, I finally opened the fireproof safe I hadn't touched in 15 years. Inside were documents that would change everything: contracts, deeds, water rights certificates, and licensing agreements that Margaret's fancy attorney had apparently never bothered to research. But the most important document was a single page dated 32 years ago, the original water rights deed that made me the sole owner of the Clearwater Reservoir and all associated distribution infrastructure. I spread the papers across my kitchen table like a general planning a decisive battle. Every legal document Margaret had thrown at me was built on a foundation of ignorance. Her attorney's threatening letters referenced HOA authority over community water resources, without realizing that there were no community water resources, only my private reservoir that I graciously licensed to the city for neighborhood distribution. But I needed more than just paperwork. I needed allies who understood the technical and legal complexities of water rights law. My first call went to Rebecca Martinez, the attorney who'd handled my original water rights acquisition 3 decades ago. She was a partner at a major firm now, but she remembered our deal perfectly. "You're the Clearwater guy," she laughed when I explained the situation. I've been waiting 30 years for someone to challenge those rights. This should be entertaining. Rebecca agreed to review Margaret's legal documents, and her assessment was even better than I'd hoped. Their attorney made fundamental errors, she explained during our meeting that afternoon. He's treating this like a standard HOA water usage dispute, but your property isn't subject to HOA water restrictions because you're not using HOA water, you're using your own water that you're generously sharing with the neighborhood. My second call went to David Chen, a hydrologist I'd worked with during the reservoir's construction. David had since become the region's leading expert on water infrastructure, and he owed me a favor from a consultation job I'd helped him land years ago. "Margaret's usage calculations are completely fabricated," he told me after reviewing her charts. "Emma's horses consume maybe 300 gallons per day maximum. Margaret's own lawn irrigation system uses more water than that." But the most important ally was completely unexpected. Janet Morrison, the county zoning inspector who'd been forced to investigate Margaret's complaints, called me directly. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, she said, frustration clear in her voice. "I've never seen someone file so many frivolous reports. Your daughter's operation is perfectly legal. It's classified as agricultural use, which is explicitly permitted in your zoning district." Janet went further than I'd hoped. "Between you and me," she continued, "I'm getting tired of Mrs. Whitfield's harassment campaigns. She's filed similar complaints against 3 other families in the past year. If you wanted to file a counter-complaint about malicious reporting, you'd have a strong case." That's when the real strategy crystallized. Margaret had built her attack on lies, intimidation, and manufactured community outrage. But she'd made every move in public, creating a perfect paper trail of harassment, defamation, and abuse of process. Her own documentation would become the evidence that destroyed her. I spent the next 3 days quietly gathering ammunition. Rebecca's firm issued subpoenas for all of Margaret's communications about Emma's business, including her Facebook posts, text messages to other neighbors, and correspondence with her attorney. David prepared a technical report dismantling every claim in Margaret's water usage analysis. Janet provided official documentation that Emma's ranch operation was fully compliant with all zoning requirements. But the nuclear option was something Margaret never saw coming. I contacted the Meadowbrook Municipal Water Authority, the city department that distributed water throughout our neighborhood. The department manager, Sarah Rodriguez, was shocked when I explained the situation. Mrs. Whitfield told our staff that she had authority to regulate water usage in your subdivision, Sarah said, pulling up records on her computer. She's been calling us weekly, demanding that we enforce restrictions on your property. We kept explaining that we can't interfere with private water rights, but she insisted that the HOA had override authority. That's when Sarah dropped the bombshell that made my entire strategy perfect. She actually filed a formal complaint with our regulatory board, claiming that you were stealing community water resources. The complaint is scheduled for a public hearing next week. Margaret hadn't just attacked my family. She'd officially challenged my water rights in a legal forum where I could respond with overwhelming force. She'd literally created the perfect venue for me to reveal the truth about who actually controlled every drop of water in our neighborhood. The hearing would be public, recorded, and attended by city officials who could immediately verify my documentation. Margaret had unknowingly arranged her own public humiliation in the most official way possible. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Instead, I called Emma and told her to invite every client, every horse trainer, and every equestrian professional she knew to attend the municipal hearing next Wednesday. It was time for Margaret to learn that some battles should never be started, especially when you don't know who you're fighting. The Meadowbrook Municipal Water Authority hearing room was packed beyond capacity on Wednesday morning. Margaret had clearly expected a small, bureaucratic proceeding where she could present her case to a handful of city officials. Instead, she walked into what looked like a public trial with standing room only and local news cameras rolling. Emma sat in the front row with 12 of her clients, including 2 Olympic alternates and a trainer who'd coached 3 gold medalists. The equestrian community had rallied around my daughter with a force that shocked even me. Behind them sat neighbors who'd grown suspicious of Margaret's increasingly erratic behavior, zoning officials who'd been harassed by her constant complaints, and municipal employees who were tired of her weekly demands for special enforcement actions. But Margaret still carried herself like she was about to deliver a knockout blow. She'd brought 3 boxes of documentation, a PowerPoint presentation loaded on her laptop, and her attorney, who looked significantly less confident than he had in his threatening letters. Sarah Rodriguez, the Water Authority manager, called the hearing to order. We're here to address Mrs. Whitfield's formal complaint alleging theft of community water resources by the Collins family. Mrs. Whitfield, you may present your case. Margaret launched into a performance that would have impressed Broadway. She presented charts showing Emma's excessive water usage, photographs of the ranch barn, and testimony from neighbors about commercial activity disrupting their residential peace. Her voice rose with righteous indignation as she painted a picture of a selfish family exploiting community resources for private profit. The Collins family has turned their property into a commercial stable operation, she declared, pointing dramatically at Emma. They're consuming thousands of gallons per day of water that belongs to this community, while the rest of us make sacrifices during drought conditions. Her attorney followed with legal citations about HOA authority and community water management, building what seemed like a compelling case for official intervention. Several neighbors, who'd been swayed by Margaret's propaganda, nodded along, convinced they were watching justice unfold. Then Sarah Rodriguez asked the question that changed everything. Mrs. Whitfield, can you clarify which community water resources you believe are being misused? Obviously, the neighborhood water supply, Margaret replied, as if the question was ridiculous. The clear water system that serves our entire subdivision. Sarah glanced at her notes, then looked directly at me. Mr. Collins, could you please approach the podium? The room fell silent as I walked forward, carrying a single manila folder. Margaret watched. With obvious confusion, she'd expected me to be the defendant, not a witness with documentation. Mr. Collins, Sarah continued, can you explain your relationship to the clear water system? I opened the folder and pulled out the document I'd been waiting 32 years to use. I own it, I said simply. The Clearwater Reservoir, the distribution infrastructure, and all associated water rights belong to me personally. Have since 1991. The silence was deafening. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror as the implications sank in. Sarah took the deed and examined it carefully. This appears to be in order. Mr. Collins, can you explain the current arrangement for neighborhood water distribution? I license the water to the city at cost for residential distribution, I explained, my voice carrying clearly through the packed room. The neighborhood receives water through my generosity, not through any community ownership or HOA authority. Margaret's attorney was frantically shuffling through his papers, clearly realizing that his entire legal argument had just collapsed. Margaret herself looked like she was witnessing her own execution. But I wasn't finished. Mrs. Whitfield has spent 2 weeks harassing my daughter about excessive water usage while irrigating her own lawn with my water. She's filed false complaints, organized harassment campaigns, and attempted to damage my daughter's legitimate business, all while using resources that belong to me. Sarah nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitfield, did you know that Mr. Collins owns the water system you're trying to regulate? Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. That's impossible. I'm afraid it's not, Sarah replied. These documents clearly establish Mr. Collins as the legal owner. Your complaint alleges theft of resources that belong to him personally. The room erupted in murmurs, gasps, and a few barely suppressed laughs. Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her PowerPoint presentation about community water theft suddenly revealed as the ravings of someone who'd never bothered to research basic facts. Furthermore, I continued, pulling out David Chen's hydrological report, Mrs. Whitfield's calculations about my daughter's water usage are fabricated. The actual consumption is less than what Mrs. Whitfield uses for her own landscaping. Margaret's world was collapsing in real time, broadcast live on local television. The woman who'd spent weeks positioning herself as the defender of community resources had just been exposed as someone harassing the very person who provided those resources. You'd think that level of public humiliation would have ended Margaret's campaign, but you'd underestimate the depths of a Karen's delusion. 3 days after the hearing, I found another note taped to our water valve, this time threatening to sue me for fraud and misrepresentation. Margaret had apparently convinced herself that my water rights were somehow fake, that I'd deceived the entire city for 30 years with forged documents. Her desperation had reached psychotic levels. She's lost her mind, Emma said, reading the latest threat over my shoulder. Dad, she's talking about hiring a private investigator to expose the truth about your water scheme. The neighborhood Facebook group had become Margaret's personal conspiracy theory platform. She posted daily rants about corruption at City Hall, claiming that officials had been bought off to support my fraudulent water claims. Her posts grew increasingly unhinged, filled with CAPITALIZED and accusations that I was part of some elaborate municipal cover-up. But Margaret's most vindictive move was trying to destroy Emma's business through online sabotage. She created fake reviews on every platform she could find, claiming that Emma mistreated animals, overcharged clients, and operated an illegal commercial facility. She used different names and email addresses, but the writing style and obsessive focus on water usage made it obvious they were all from the same source. That's when I decided Margaret needed to learn about consequences in the most direct way possible. My first move was purely legal. Rebecca Martinez filed a comprehensive harassment lawsuit that included defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with business relationships. The fake reviews alone provided enough evidence for substantial damages, but Margaret's documented campaign of intimidation created a textbook case that law students would probably study for years. But the real lesson came through the water system itself. See, Margaret had apparently never wondered why her water pressure was so consistently perfect, why her sprinkler system never experienced the fluctuations that plagued other developments, or why her monthly water bills were surprisingly reasonable. As the system owner, I'd been maintaining optimal pressure and flow rates for the entire neighborhood, absorbing maintenance costs and infrastructure upgrades as part of my licensing agreement with the city. That arrangement was entirely voluntary on my part. Margaret learned this the hard way on a Tuesday morning when her sprinklers failed to turn on for her scheduled 6 a.m. lawn watering. By noon, her water pressure had dropped to a trickle. By evening, she was getting just enough flow for basic household needs, drinking, cooking, and essential hygiene, but nothing else. She called the city water department in a rage, demanding immediate repairs to what she assumed was a system failure. Sarah Rodriguez calmly explained that there was no failure. Mr. Collins had simply adjusted the pressure settings for her specific address to comply with drought conservation measures. "He can't do that," Margaret screamed into the phone, loud enough that I could hear her from my front yard. "There are laws. There are regulations." "Mrs. Whitfield," Sarah replied with barely concealed satisfaction, "Mr. Collins owns the system. He can set whatever pressure levels he deems appropriate for his equipment's optimal performance." Margaret's perfectly maintained lawn began turning brown within a week. Her elaborate flower gardens withered in the summer heat. The fountain in her front yard sat empty and silent. Meanwhile, every other house in the neighborhood continued enjoying full water pressure and unlimited usage. The psychological impact was devastating. Margaret would stand in her dying garden, watching her neighbor's automatic sprinklers run normally while hers remained dry and useless. The visual reminder of her powerlessness was constant and unavoidable. But Margaret's most humiliating moment came when she tried to organize a boycott of my water monopoly. She went door to door trying to convince neighbors to join her in demanding that the city force me to restore her full water access. The response was universal mockery. Neighbors, who'd initially supported her HOA complaints, now saw her as the neighborhood crazy person who'd picked a fight with the man who literally provided their water. Mrs. Henderson actually slammed the door in Margaret's face. Mr. Rodriguez told her to get help before refusing to sign her petition. Even Margaret's own attorney abandoned her case when he realized that challenging my water rights would require proving that 30 years of municipal contracts were fraudulent. The potential legal costs and guaranteed failure made it impossible for him to continue representation. Margaret was completely isolated, publicly humiliated, and facing a lawsuit that would likely cost her everything she owned. Her campaign to destroy Emma had backfired so spectacularly that she'd become a local laughingstock, while my daughter's business thrived with support from the entire equestrian community. But Margaret still had one final card to play, and her last desperate move would prove that some people never learn when to admit defeat. Section 8. Resolution and Morale. Margaret's final act of desperation came on a sweltering August morning when I found her in my backyard at 5 a.m., bolt cutters in hand, trying to physically damage the main water line that fed the entire neighborhood. She'd apparently decided that if she couldn't control the water system, she'd destroy it entirely, taking down everyone's supply in some twisted act of mutual assured destruction. "Margaret, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, running toward her as she struggled with the heavy pipe connections. She spun around, bolt cutters raised like a weapon, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "You ruined my life," she screamed, her voice breaking with exhaustion and rage. "I was respected in this community. I had authority. I mattered." That's when I finally understood what this had always been about. Margaret hadn't really cared about water usage or zoning violations or Emma's horses. She'd been desperately clinging to the only power she'd ever had. Her position as HOA president and my family's success had somehow threatened that fragile sense of importance. "You ruined your own life," I said, keeping my voice calm while mentally calculating how much damage she could do to the neighborhood's water supply. "Nobody took anything from you, Margaret. You destroyed yourself trying to tear down my daughter. She doesn't deserve any of this." Margaret gestured wildly at Emma's ranch, at our property, at everything we'd built. Perfect horses, perfect business, perfect father who gives her everything. Some people work their whole lives and get nothing, and she just gets handed success. The envy and bitterness that had driven Margaret's campaign poured out in a torrent of resentment. She'd spent months watching Emma's accomplishments, while her own children disappointed her at every turn. My daughter's success had become a daily reminder of Margaret's failures as a parent and as a person. I called 911 while keeping her talking. "Emma earned everything she has, Margaret. She spent 15 years training, competing, studying. She works 18-hour days building her business. With your money, with your connections, with your secret water empire." Margaret was sobbing now, the bolt cutters trembling in her grip. "I did everything right. I followed all the rules. I volunteered for every committee. And what do I have to show for it?" The sheriff's deputy arrived just as Margaret finally dropped the tools and collapsed onto the ground, completely broken. The sight of this woman who'd terrorized my family for months, reduced to a crying mess on my lawn, should have felt like victory. Instead, it was just sad. Margaret was arrested for criminal trespass, attempted vandalism, and violating the restraining order that Rebecca had filed weeks earlier. The criminal charges, combined with the pending civil lawsuit, meant she'd likely lose her house to pay legal fees and damages. Her husband filed for divorce the following week, apparently having reached his limit with her escalating behavior. Emma's business not only survived Margaret's campaign, but thrived because of it. The publicity from the municipal hearing had introduced her to clients across 3 states who wanted to train with the woman who'd stood up to HOA tyranny. Her booking calendar filled up 6 months in advance, and she started getting calls from Olympic scouts interested in her rehabilitation techniques. But the real resolution came 3 months later when Emma made the U.S. Olympic development team, the same program she'd missed by a fraction before. The training business had given her the financial stability to compete again, and the confidence she'd gained from defending herself against Margaret had made her riding fearless and precise. Margaret's attempt to destroy my daughter's dreams had actually made them come true. The neighborhood elected a new HOA president who focused on actual community issues instead of manufactured drama. Property values increased as news of our successful water management spread to other developments. The equestrian facility became a source of pride for residents instead of resentment. Margaret moved away quietly, selling her house at a loss to pay her legal bills. I heard she relocated to a different state, where presumably she'd find new neighbors to terrorize with her imaginary authority. The lesson here isn't complicated. Never underestimate quiet people, because silence isn't weakness, it's often strategy. Margaret spent months making noise, filing complaints, and wielding her perceived power like a weapon. But real power doesn't announce itself with threats and documents. Real power is built through decades of careful planning, legitimate ownership, and strategic patience. Emma learned that success always attracts jealous people who will try to tear you down rather than build themselves up. But she also learned that when you've earned your place legitimately, the truth will always protect you from liars. And me? I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves while you control all the water. If you're dealing with a HOA Karen or any bully who thinks they can intimidate you into submission, remember this story. Document everything, know your rights, and never let someone else's jealousy dim your family's success. Because at the end of the day, real power speaks softly and carries the deed to the neighborhood water supply. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about justice, served ice cold, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my situation?